All right, we're going to talk about the new brushes and brush settings that are in R3. But first, let's talk about mirror and weld. Before I start demoing these brushes, I want to go ahead and make his face symmetrical. One way to do that, which we talked about in part 1, is using Smart Resim. Instead of doing that, I'm going to go under Geometry. I'm going to drop him down to Subdivision Level 4, and I'm going to delete higher and delete lower so he doesn't have any subdivision history anymore. And if you keep scrolling down, you'll notice there's a new mirror and weld button. And by default, X is on, which means it's going to mirror and weld across the X-axis from the positive to the negative. So if I hit mirror and weld, what that's going to do is mirror and weld him. You may see no difference between this and Smart Resim. Where the difference comes in is, if I go into a transposed line, I'm going to turn off X symmetry so I can just rotate him to the right. And then if I do mirror and weld across the X-axis now, it's actually going to mirror and weld his head into one seamless mesh. You can see. And you can actually turn on X symmetry again, and you can actually smooth this out and sculpt right across here. So it is one seamless mesh, and you can get some interesting results using organic stuff such as this, and you can keep doing it. Rotate this out and we'll move it over. Mirror and weld across the X-axis. And of course you can do it across multiple axes if you want. We'll turn on X and Z and we'll hit mirror and weld. I'll mirror it across the X and Z axis. So you can see you can get some pretty fast base meshes out of this mirror and weld using organic stuff, or if you want to put some gears and wires or anything in there, you can also mirror and weld and get some really cool mechanical things going as well. We're back to our mirrored and welded head before we went crazy with the mirror and weld options. And we're going to go ahead and talk about the new brush settings and brushes that are in ZBrush R3. And what we're going to do is first we're going to hit B to go into the brush menu, and I'm going to hit T, and let's look at these new trim brushes we have. We're going to talk about trim and polish first. So we've got a whole bunch of trim brushes down here, which are similar to the planer brushes we talked about in part 1, but they're a little different, and I love using these things. To look at the new polish brushes, what we can do is we can hit the space bar, and I'll clear our selection. Then I'm going to hit P, and we've got polish brush, B, C, and D. As well as, hit spacebar again, M, which will be M polish, which is under medium polish, or S, which is S polish, which is soft polish, and H. Now when I hit H, it's going to throw hard polish into my brush because that's the only brush that actually starts with H. So we'll go ahead and hit B again, and T, and Trim Adaptive is very similar to the planer brush. Let's go ahead and use Trim Dynamic, which I really like. So Trim Dynamic selected, I'm going to crank the Z intensity up just a bit. And, turn on the X symmetry. And Trim will actually, it'll trim your model, but it'll also maintain its curves as you go along the surface. So you can go in here, and you can really just turn this guy into a robot pretty fast just by using the Trim Dynamic. You also noticed while we were in there, we had Trim Dynamic Trail. Go ahead and talk about trails just for a minute. We're going to open up the brush menu and we're going to throw it over here. I don't need this right now. And under modifiers, we have a couple more things in here. Tilt, which we'll get into later. But for now, trails, which if you hold down this, basically multiplies your brush whatever number you have in here as you stroke. So this one's trail set to 5. So as you use your dynamic brush, it'll multiply that stroke over and over again as you go. And with a combination of smoothing out and using the trim brushes, let's go ahead and go back to our Trim Dynamic. I love. You can get some really fast hard edge shapes. And we'll go ahead and refine these with the polished brush. But first, let's go ahead and just trim them down just a bit. Again, just using Shift to smooth them out, and then using the Trim Dynamic just to carve them down. And I'm using this on a head, which will turn him into I don't know, some sort of robotic-looking guy. But of course, you could do this with cars. You could do a really quick Z sketch and make some armor. But as you can see, it's super fast just to get these nice hard edges in there. Trim this out back down here. And again, we're on Trim Dynamic, so it's actually following the curvature of the surface underneath. If you wanted to trim, say, from the camera view, what you could do is go into Brush, Trim, and you could do Trim Front, which I think Yeah, brush trims the sculpted surface in the screen plane. So depending on where your screen is looking, it'll actually trim from that plane. As well as under brush, you can go to trim hole, and that's also based on the screen, I believe, but you can just trim a hole right into your mesh. That's cool. But we'll go back to trim dynamic. And we'll just go ahead and keep carving this guy up. And you can keep modifying your brush size to get a little more exact trims in there. And I'm not real worried about what I'm doing, but you could get in here and get real specific about where you wanted to carve it up. And again, you don't need a super hard edge surface or with a bunch of edge loops or anything. And we'll talk about how to add edge loops or group loops anyways with poly painting in just a minute. But for now, we'll just go ahead and trim this down. There we go. We've got a robotic head using just the trim dynamic and the holding down shift and smoothing him. And trim this down. And before we start polishing, I'm going to bump him up once. I'm going to bring back our geometry. I'm going to hit divide one more time. And now let's talk about polishing. To show off polishing, I'm going to use the H polish. So what we're going to do is go B and then H, and then I'll throw H polish up here. And as we H polish, which is hard polish, that's going to do is it's going to, these polish brushes, what they say they do is it polishes the sculpted surface, and then when you're working along an edge where two planes meet, the edge is preserved. And how that does that is underneath the samples, underneath the brush menu, you'll notice we now have a preserve edge, and this one's set to 30.5. So that'll preserve your edge as you polish the surface. So it's going to kind of smooth the surface out, but it's also going to not smooth your edges out. That's a cool new feature in R3. You can go in here, and you can polish the heck out of them, and really get a really nice quality finish on what's supposed to be, you know, a hard edge surface, probably metal or something. You can go in here and polish. And if you really want to shine them on, you can go to these new chrome materials, and as you polish, you can kind of see what it would do on a surface like this. So with really long, even brush strokes with the polish brush, you can get some really cool hard edge organic surfaces, which is really useful and fast. That's a new polish brush, and you can see it kind of polishes that surface and keeps those edges sharp. You're not losing the hardness to it, but you're also refining the surface a bit. Go back into our Matcap Gray. Those are really useful brushes. There's also a lot of useful brushes that aren't in the brush menu, surprisingly. If you go up here, let's talk about a clay finish brush. That's a finisher, and it's not in here. What you got to do is you got to go to Lightbox, and if you go to the brushes options, you'll see a whole ton of brushes in here, and we'll talk about a couple of those. But here's a clay finish brush, so just double click it, throw it into your brush menu, and you can play around with a lot of these. I'm going to crank that intensity up, and this will give you a little bit more of a rougher finish, but it's kind of like a polished brush. But there's a ton of brushes in there now that aren't in the brush menu but are actually really useful. Let's go ahead and go back into our light box, and we'll go down here to the damn standard brush. That's a brush I always meant to check out, but never did. But now that it's in there, I've actually used it, and it's awesome. Hold down Alt, you can kind of dig into your surface, and then using your trim brushes, you can kind of trim these out. So the damn standard brush is a really cool brush to kind of dig in nice fluid shapes. And then using a combination of trim and polish, you could actually go in there and carve out some really cool stuff. You can also, of course, use a smooth brush. So just really interesting ways to do that. Let's go back into our light box, and we'll go check out some of these skins. Keep scrolling back until we get to, here we go, Scales Fish. So we'll go ahead and double click that. Look at the Scales Fish brush. And just real quick, I'm going to show you what it does. I'm going to crank the Z intensity up just a bit. I'm just going to brush that onto our surface. And it looks like it's dragging scales out, and that's cool. but where this is really cool, make that intensity up just a little bit more. If you zoom in, you'll see what it's doing is it's applying an alpha, but it's also applying a tilt. So it's actually overlapping these scales as we brush. Where that comes into play is underneath the brush menu, under the modifiers, you'll see that the tilt brush is set to 60, and that's the angle of the tilt, and constant tilt is set on. So if you drop this down to 0, you'll see is it's just bumping straight out from based on the normal of the object. If you tilt it up to 90, it's going to be almost parallel to the surface, which is what we don't want. So bump that down to 55, and you'll see it just tilts that brush so that it overlaps. So scales and feathers and all that good stuff is really easy to do now with R3 with the new tilt function. And like we discussed in part 1, if you go under the stroke menu, you've also got the backtrack, which is new to 3.5. But we went over that in part 1, so I'm not going to go back over that again, but just remember that it's there. And we'll go back in our standard brush. And let's talk about the new smooth options. To check out your smooth options, you have to hold down Shift. And as you hold down Shift, you can actually make all the changes up here that you want to. For example, if you want to turn off RGB, and so you can just smooth geometry and not your poly paint, you can do that. Also, while you're holding down Shift, you're into the smooth brush options. First, let's open up B and hit S to look at the smooth brushes. You'll see that there's smooth crease, groups. Some of these we've talked about in part 1, but these new ones like Stronger, Subdiv, Valance, where those come into play, I'm hold down Shift, so we're in the smooth brush options. I'm going to scroll down here, and under the smooth brush modifiers, you're going to see a new weighted smooth mode. And if you hold down Control, it'll actually show you what all those do. I'm not going to go into all of these, but feel free to go in there and read them. But for example, like number 7, if this is actually bumped up to number 7, it's going to be it'll maintain the creased edge when smoothed out, which is useful. And when you're in 7 mode, you can actually do this weight strength, which will give you even more control. So that's some cool new stuff that are that's in the smooth options. So definitely go in and check out the new brush options that are available to you in R3, as well as going in the Lightbox and checking out all these brushes out up here. I went into brushes pretty thoroughly on part 1, so I'm not going to overdo it on part 2. But just be aware that they're all up here, and definitely play out with them and check out their settings, because they're totally awesome.